Sabrosura pa' ti que.
Hello, everyone. This is Pam, the Café con Pam, the bilingual podcast that features Latine and people of the global majority who break barriers, change lives, and make this world a better place. Welcome to episode 372 of Café con Pam. Today, we have a conversation with LAZOU. LAZOU is an award-winning nominated podcaster, music maker, and tech consultant for creatives. Her podcast, Nuances, Our Asian Stories, features fun, uplifting, yet thought-provoking conversations with the Asian diaspora at the intersection of career, culture, and community. Boasting 50-plus episodes and 2 award nominations in less than 2 years, the 5th season is a limited narrative series that will have listeners questioning everything they thought they knew about queerness, love, and pre-modern life in Asia. LAZOU's music has been featured on The Young and the Restless, True Lies, Real Girlfriends in Paris, among others. She writes fluently in English and French and releases music under LAZOU and 23rd Hour. Listeners, my conversation with LAZOU was a lot of fun. I got to learn so much about the Asian experience, which is very different. And at the same time, there's some similarities from Latinos, which is my experience. And so I think LAZOU and I could totally come back and keep talking about the various ways of existing in this country. I won't talk about this anymore. I'll just let you enjoy this interview with LAZOU. Sin más, here's my conversation with LAZOU.
Sabrosura pa' ti que.
LAZOU, welcome to Café con Pam.
Thank you so much for having me, Pam.
Yes, the question that we always ask is, what is your heritage?
I am of Chinese descent, but I've never been to China. I don't speak Chinese at all. I grew up on a tiny island east of Madagascar. It's called Mauritius. It's the only place the dodo bird ever lived. And it's the place where you see the underwater waterfall that is very popular online. I don't know if you've seen it, but those are the two things people know about Mauritius. It's the underwater waterfall and the dodo.
Wow. And you grew up there.
Mm-hmm.
How did we make it here?
Well, actually, I was born in Canada. My parents moved back because they didn't like the cold. And then I grew up there. I went back to Canada for my university degree. And after I graduated, the first job I got was in tech. And the company got acquired in Silicon Valley. So we moved to Silicon Valley. And that's how I ended up in California.
And here we are still.
And here we are.
How was it for you to grow up in a small-ish, like an island type of place?
Oh, yeah.
And then coming to Canada and then going into such a big city?
Yeah, it was quite different. Mauritius is about the size of Oahu. So very small, 1.2 million people. And there's barely any white people other than tourists. So I grew up in a very, very different environment where everybody around me was people of color. I barely ever saw white people. And I was a minority as a light-skinned person. Most people around me were of South Asian or African descent. So yeah, very different. Christianity was not the dominant religion necessarily.
That's big.
Yeah, like so many things were different.
And so you make it to Canada. How was college or university?
It was great. It was my first time being in a big city, and things are open late. There was a grocery store that was open 24/7. I thought that was the coolest thing ever. Toronto was a really, really diverse place, and University of Toronto is a really big campus, like 90,000 students. So, there were people from all over the world. So it didn't feel as much of a culture shock because everybody was coming from everywhere else. And I also had family in town, and there was a Mauritian student association at each of the big colleges around. So
wow,
there were a bunch of Mauritians around if I wanted to hang out with Mauritians. And so, yeah, I didn't feel homesick at all. I just didn't like the cold as much. The first year it was cool seeing snow for the first time,
Right.
everything is new. And then by the second year, it's like, okay, I'm tired of this.
Yes. It gets old really fast. Yes. I understand.
Yeah, for sure. But moving to the US was much more of a culture shock than moving to Canada. I think growing up, Canada, Europe, US, Australia, it's all the West to me.
Okay.
So I didn't really even think about the fact that there are cultural differences between, say, Canada and the US. They're like one on top of the other, like they both speak English, whatever. It's the same thing. Then I suddenly have this job offer on my lap and they say, "Why don't you move to Silicon Valley? We'll pay for your move." Like, okay, that sounds fun. California, great weather. I'm down. And the first thing, before I even moved to the US, the first thing you have to do is fill out all the paperwork. And on the paperwork, I find out that I will be deemed as a non resident alien in this
Mm.
country, which was very jarring as a term to see on a form. Because in Canada, they were much more polite about it. And they would be like, immigrant or like new Canadian or, something like that.
That's much more gentle.
Yeah. Here it's like, you're alien. Welcome, resident alien. It's like, okay, that makes a girl feel welcome. Very
Totally.
much. So yeah, that's when the culture shock happened. Like before I even set foot in the country, I was like, whoa, I wonder if that informs everything that happens in terms of the conversation about immigration. Like the tone is very different. Yeah, so I moved to Silicon Valley, which again is very diverse relative to a lot of places, right?
Mm-hmm.
Definitely more white than before, but still pretty diverse. Tech, especially lots of Asians. Um, and then slowly, with the 2016 elections and then 2020 and everything else, like over time, I started to learn more about this country and the history and just the dynamics in terms of race and everything. Because, growing up, all I knew about the West is what I see in movies. And in the movies, it's a very sanitized, very idealized version of what the American dream is, right? And I guess, you're a kid, you watch these movies, they seem pretty liberal. You're like, oh, America is a place where you can be who you want to be, love who you want to love, and, you can achieve all your dreams. And then you get here and you're like, wait, this is not all of America, though.
No, not at all.
So, yeah, that was a culture shock for sure.
Totally. And I'm curious because when you mentioned that there's a lot of Mauritian student organizations in Canada,
Mhm.
is that like a typical migration pattern? Like to migrate to Canada? Is that why?
Well, in the big cities, Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, there's a relatively sizable Mauritian community of people who've moved there. Because Mauritius is such a small country, you don't have as many career opportunities if you want to do like anything in the sciences, for example, right? Like if you want to do research, there's not really that much going on in Mauritius itself. So if that's something you want to do, you have to go somewhere else. And so for people who are interested in careers that aren't available locally, they try to go abroad and study abroad. And also you get paid a lot more, you
Mm-hmm.
know. So a lot of people go to Australia. A lot of people go to um, China, India. A bunch of my friends went to study there. Some go to Europe, but Europe's more expensive. Bunch go to Canada. Not as many in the US because the US is way more expensive than Canada.
Wow.
Yeah.
And not as immigrant friendly, contrary to popular belief, I think.
Yeah. I mean, even in Canada, because I was born in Canada, I paid the local fee, which
Yep.
is very, very affordable. But international students would pay about, I think, 15 to 20,000 Canadian dollars a year. That's still cheaper than
Totally.
the US. Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
Wow. So to bring it back to, you moved to Silicon Valley. That was a bigger culture shock. Did you face the model minority phenomenon that happens to Asians?
Not personally, but I do see stereotypes about Asian people that are believed in the corporate world. I have always been, as you can probably tell, very outspoken. If I have an opinion, you're gonna hear about it. I'm not the quiet Asian girl. And so I think because of that, sometimes, I'm not put in that same box. And also because I have an American accent. That also, I think, reduces the stereotypes that people have about me. I don't know. But I noticed that in the office, the Asian people who had accents, the Asian people who were quieter, they were assumed to have certain limited ambitions, to not want to move up the corporate ladder, to not want to become managers, to not be leadership material. Yeah, so I didn't see it personally, for me, but I saw it for other people.
That's fascinating, because I thought it was the opposite.
What do you mean?
Well, and I think there's intricacies and layers within the stereotype of, because then you have Southeast Asia, there's so much within it. For me as a Latina, there's also layers of it. And I don't know if you concur with this thought, but Latinos often say that we're not a monolith, how we are often put in oh, all of a sudden you're Latina and, you have to fit all of this, which we don't at all.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking it's probably the same.
Yeah, it's definitely the same for Asian. And a lot of Southeast Asians don't like it. A lot of South Asians don't like it. I think when you say Asian, people think people who look like me, East Asian, like Korean, Chinese, Japanese. And even if you look at the socioeconomic, distribution, like income distribution, or, in terms of percentage of people who have degrees and all of that, it's so diverse. And if you break it down into those different groups, it's very different. But we're just lumped into this Asian category. And yeah, it's the same for you guys.
I know. And I think I have a theory that the US wants to just put people in boxes, and white people, it's very easy to put in boxes because it's you is just white. But everyone else doesn't quite. And so it's how do we reduce them to one tiny limited, checkbox?
Yeah. And I think the other interesting part of that is it is a bunch of different types of white, but they've chosen to erase that part of their identity to be part of the white group, right? And so, yeah, it's assimilation versus, being discriminated against. They were like, okay, I guess we're white now.
Totally. And I mean, we should probably have a white person here defend that role, but we'll move on. Because there's also, I mean, it's just a lot. I think I don't want to get into this rabbit hole. Maybe we can, I don't know. But when some European white people, when they say, oh, I'm German, and German people, I've actually had conversations with people that come from Germany. They're like, no, you're not. You're American. And so it's this very interesting dichotomy that exists with people that are of descent.
Well, even for us, right? I don't know if you have that when you go to any Latin American countries, but if I go to Asia, they don't consider me Asian at all. They're like, I don't know what you are.
Yes. Yes. Or they call you American. They call me American.
Well, especially before I moved to America, I was like, I come from this African island. They're like, how come you don't look like Africans. I'm like, well, some Africans look like me. I don't know what to tell you.
Right. Well, and it goes back to this assumption of how the world started and how the world isn't
Yeah.
that now.
Yeah.
Like diverse. This is why. And I think the diasporas and like migration patterns and all of the things that like we just cannot assume that someone is something just because they look like
Yeah.
whatever idea we have of that.
Yeah.
And I think having these conversations allow people to open up their mind, especially as we are in an election year and there's lots of thoughts.
Lots of thoughts.
Lots of things happening. So you are in Silicon Valley. You're navigating the intricacies of like being in a new place, being considered an alien, all of the things. How do you decide to get out of it? What happens that you're like, you know what? I'm done with this life.
My first love was always music and creating. I've always been a creative person, but growing up on a tiny island in the middle of the Indian Ocean, becoming an artist is not a career path. Even the most well-known artists on the island, whether it's music, whether it's something else, like usually they have a day job, right? Like they're doing it on the side, but they have a day job. So I could not ever justify asking my parents to pay for me to go to a college to learn music and then not know if I will be able to even sustain myself, let alone help them if they need to. So I never even asked them if I could go do a music degree. I was also a nerd as a kid. I loved science. I loved programming. And computer science sounded like something I could get a job with. So I was like, okay, I'll do that because I like that too. So I did. I was very, very lucky that I landed this job in Silicon Valley where I was given stock options. I had a really good salary. And I did that for 5 years. I helped them pay for my brother's education. Because, Mauritian rupee to Canadian dollar or US dollar is not a great conversion, not a great thing. So once I was done that, my brother had graduated. Um, it was the first time that I felt like I didn't have any expectations to meet. Like I wasn't, nobody was depending on me financially. Like my parents were, they were about to retire, but they're okay. And my brother also is like starting to work. He's fine. And so I felt like now is a time that I could do something for myself.
So you're an eldest daughter.
Yes.
Okay. That's a whole other rabbit hole.
So then my husband also was in tech and he was also kind of done. He also wanted to spend more time doing creative stuff. So we decided to plan our exit.
Okay.
I stayed another year or so, just like planning my exit, figuring out, we crunched the numbers, like how much money do we need to live every month. We decided to downsize. We sold a bunch of stuff and we kind of figured out how long will our money sustain us if we made $0, and what can we afford ourselves based on what we have. And again, because we were in Silicon Valley, we were very lucky that we both had stock options and all those things. So yeah, I was very, very privileged to be able to do that. So I planned the exit for a year. I gave my notice. I helped transition all of my projects to people, and and then I never looked back.
Here we are. So let's take a quick coffee break.
All right.
Sabrosura pa' ti que que.
LAZOU, do you drink coffee?
I do.
Tell me, are you drinking coffee now?
No, because it's a little late in the day and I won't be able to sleep. I did have coffee like 2 hours ago, but I'm drinking tea right now. But coffee, I like just black coffee.
Okay. How do you brew it? Do you brew it at home?
Yeah.
And do you have a method?
We just do drip. Like we have a glass thing. I don't know what the terms are. I think it's the Chemex. I'm not sure.
Okay.
My husband does the coffee.
Okay.
So yeah, it's just drip.
But black.
Black, yeah.
Okay. Any specific type of coffee from a specific country?
Right now we're drinking, I believe it's Venezuelan coffee,
Oh.
and it's we drink half calf because otherwise I get too
I
caffeinated.
understand. I understand. Venezuelan coffee is not as common. Huh.
Yeah.
Okay.
How about you?
One of my favorites is Ethiopian coffee.
Mm.
It's because of the wash. So it has to be a very specific, it has to be, and of course, by now I forgot the wash. So all the coffee lovers, they're going to be like correcting me in their cars or whatever they listen to. I'm not even going to try to butcher it because it's going to be wrong. But basically, the beans are dried outside.
Mm.
And so the notes of Ethiopian coffee that has that very specific wash are more on the sweeter side
Hmm.
and not as bitter as Arabica coffee.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, but it's like one of those things that if you drink regular coffee every day, like you won't notice that difference. But yeah, that's kind of like if I was to pay for a pound of like relatively expensive coffee, I would do Ethiopian.
I'll have to go try that.
Yeah. But it has to be that specific wash. So I'll get back to you or you can ask them like, was this dried outside? There's a name for it. But basically, but yeah. So today it's later in the day, so I am no longer drinking coffee. I'm drinking water, but I did have a cup of coffee this morning and it was great. So what kind of tea are you drinking?
It's a blue colored tea.
Oh.
It's a Numi tea. I don't remember what it's called. But it has flowers in it. That's why it gets like a bluish color.
How fun.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I love those teas. Okay, let's get back to the show.
Sabrosura pa' ti que que.
So you planned your exit for a year, which I think that's important to mention. And it's also like I love the context that you give us because many times we see people like they're like, yeah, I left corporate world and then I started, and we need all those little pieces of context of like you were vested or you had stock options and you planned it for a year, so it wasn't like you just quit and like like me, I did that. Because I think that gives a lot more foundation for people that might be looking to do that.
Yeah, I think it's very, very important if somebody wants to leave their corporate job to crunch the numbers. Like I know that when I decided I wanted to leave, like I would have loved to just leave like right then. I was like, you know,
Yes.
but that would not have been smart, you know.
Yeah.
You need to know how much of a runway you have, right? And what is your worst case scenario and what is your contingency plan if your worst case scenario happens. Yeah, so I think that's why I always talk about this, because I think it's a bit of a myth where people say, oh, quit your day job. It's like, maybe not right away. Maybe do the math first.
100% do the math. And I think it's really cool and really powerful for people to have a corporate job and run a business.
Yes, absolutely.
I think the side hustle people, kudos to you. 100%. I'm like,
Yeah.
I would do that if I could.
Yeah, because the other thing too that you don't really think about is, yeah, you don't have to go to a corporate job, but you don't have healthcare, you don't have
Right.
insurance, like all of those things. Right now, I'm paying like over $500 a month for insurance. That it adds up. So you really have to look at all your expenses, all the benefits that you have at work. And for a while, there's a lot of great things about corporate world. There were, because I was at a really big company, there were a lot of clubs, and there were like filmmaking clubs and like music clubs, and and so you could learn from so many different groups of people. It was an easy way to make connections, right? Like there's so many benefits to being in a corporate world. And like, if your job, for example, involves traveling, you accumulate points and you can use those to go to conferences that you want, or like pay for your flights and whatnot. So
There's perks.
yeah, like corporate perks should not be underestimated for sure.
Agreed. 100%. Yeah, like my partner, we were talking about his company perks, and I'm like, do I have access? Like, can I get Apple products at 50% off? Like, that's not the perk, but like things like that you're like, what?
Yeah.
And then like for me, it also kind of, for me as a business owner, I'm like, I want my business to get to that point where I get those awesome discounts.
Yeah.
So it's like once you're on the other side, it's almost like inspirational in a way.
Yeah.
So maybe like looking back at your perks, bringing them to you now, that would be fun. Okay, so you both leave at the same time?
He was already kind of semi-retired at that point. So it wasn't much of a leap for him. It was more like he gradually stopped doing the contract work that he was doing. Like he just stopped taking more contract work.
Just to keep it in that lens for a little bit, of course you had a conversation, but for you personally, what was a good runway to have? Was it 6 months? Was it a year? What made you feel stable that you were like, okay, I have enough for 15 years of my life or whatever?
At the time, just from what I had accumulated, I think I was good for over a year.
That's solid.
I would have to sell stocks, of course, to do that.
Right.
But given the stocks, I could hold off for quite a while. And since then, the stocks have gone way up. So that's great.
Glad you didn't sell.
And by the way, anybody who's listening to this, go get a corporate job that gives you stock options. Like
100%. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think having more than a year definitely made me feel comfortable because like even it's like the worst case scenario where I can't get anything done, even just my own thing, like even if he leaves me,
right.
like, I'll be okay. He didn't leave me. We're still together. And he also has his own that he accumulated. So yeah, we were very, very lucky and privileged to do that. I realize that that's not something that everybody has. So I always want to acknowledge that. But at the same time, if you are in a corporate job where you do have a little bit of a nest egg, it might not be as out of reach as you think. You just gotta figure out what your priorities are. Like, for example, I never go out and buy coffee. I always make my own coffee. I don't eat out very often. So you can decide, what you want to prioritize and what is really important to you. So we don't go out to eat much, but we love going to concerts. We're both musicians, right? So once in a while we'll splurge and go to music events that maybe are a bit expensive. But, we're not spending money at bars. We're not spending money buying Starbucks, So
right.
yeah, you can figure out what your priorities are.
Totally. And spend based on that. Because, I mean, there could be the foodie people that love food.
Yeah.
And they go out every whatever.
Exactly. Like if that's what's important to you, then you factor that in. And then
totally,
maybe there's other things that you don't really care that much about that you're spending on, right?
So you leave, you give yourself your year. Do you have a plan? Like, do you know how you're going to survive moving forward?
Sort of. Those stock options are great. I cannot underestimate, I cannot understate just how important that was. But my goal and his goal as well was to spend more time doing what we love. And also for me, I wanted to go back home and spend time with family without having the pressure of going back to work. Because when you're in school, you can go during the summer, but once you start working, you don't really have much vacation. As Americans know, we don't have a lot of those here.
Right.
So it's a 27-hour flight minimum for me to go
Wow.
back. Usually it's 30 plus.
Really?
Yeah.
So you go LA?
So from LA, I could go to Dubai, and that's a 16-hour flight, and then another 6.5 hours to Mauritius, with usually a 5-hour transit in between or something like that. Or I could go to Paris, which is an 11-hour flight, and then another 11-hour and 40 minutes to Mauritius, with like usually a 2-hour layover, which is pretty insane. And they usually lose one of your luggage.
Oh my gosh.
You could also go the other way, like go Asia, but that would be longer.
Okay.
There's no easy way. Like it's literally the other side of the world.
For sure. Dang.
Yeah. And so after I quit, we went on a trip for like 2 months, and we spent time with my family. We had a really nice time. Like, yeah, for the first time, like I didn't have to worry about being online at 3 a.m. or, any of that.
Because
So,
time too.
yeah, because it's 11 hours ahead.
Oof.
Yeah.
So you give yourself that. That was an awesome gift. So you give yourself that gift, travel, and then you came back.
We came back. I started going full steam, learning how to produce music in our own studio, building out our own studio. The goal was to get our music in film and TV. That's one of the few ways you can still make money as a musician. Because streaming pays nothing. I don't know if you know anything about that, but streaming pays like literally nothing. So yeah, the goal was to be able to do that, and we did. Like we were able to do that. It's definitely a grind. Like you don't get that consistently. You have to keep pitching music, keep writing new music, keep putting music out. But 2 years ago, I think it was 2 years ago, we got our first placement on a major TV network that was fully written and produced in our own studio by me.
Nice.
And that was really rewarding.
How long did it take to like from conversation starting to completion of the project?
Oh, so I was working with a publisher. She gave me a brief, like I need a song that's got these things, like there's a checklist of things that they want. So it's a French song, and it has to be about like a summery theme and feel very like light, or something like that. So we wrote this song, we sent it to her, she loved it, and then she pitched it. I think it took a few months for her to find a project that was interested in using it. And then the project was kind of on hold for like almost a year.
Oh my gosh.
So yeah, it took a while from when she said, hey, this pilot really wants to use it, to the pilot actually being on TV. That took a while. And then because of how royalties work, when it's on TV, you have to wait another like 6 months for your first royalties for that to come in. And then another 6 months for like international royalties. I don't know. It's like, it's a mess.
So you don't get paid immediately.
You don't get paid immediately for sure.
Did you know this going in?
Oh yeah. I definitely researched a lot. I read a lot. I read a lot of music business books. Yeah, I can answer a lot of music copyright questions now.
Because I think it's also interesting. It is interesting, but also important for aspiring musicians who are like, okay, this sounds cool. But then also giving that context of you have to wait.
Yeah, you can't just bank on that because, first of all, you're never guaranteed. Even when they said, we want to use this in a pilot, maybe the pilot never sees the light of day, right? That's one. Maybe it does see the light of day, but at the last minute, they're like, you know what? We're going to cut out the scene. Your song is dropped. Or at the last minute, somebody says, hey, we got a song from Billie Eilish that is going to bring more viewers. So your song has
Mhm.
dropped. Like there's so many things that could go wrong until the very last minute, until they actually air the thing. You don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, you can't count on guarantees at all.
I know, it's so wild.
And so yeah, basically, I think all musicians who are doing this know this. Like you have to have multiple streams of income or a day job or some other way of not freaking out about money.
Totally. Totally. And I was on the other side. I did a commercial and same thing. We literally a full day of shooting, and I don't know, it was like I did probably, and it was a commercial, so probably 30-45 minutes worth of footage. I showed up 2 seconds, maybe 5 of all. But to your point of like, you don't know what's going to come out until it's like, oh, and I didn't know it came out until people were messaging me like, did we just see you on TV? And I'm like, oh yeah, the 2 seconds, sure. But then because of those 3 seconds, 5 seconds, whatever, that's when I ended up getting the royalties later. So 100%, you don't bank on it because it's like, who knows? They might not like anything I said.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a very complicated mess of royalty streams, for sure.
So how did nuanced come about?
So throughout the pandemic, all the music conferences had to move to Zoom, right?
Mm.
And I met a fellow Asian American woman in one of those Zoom sessions. So in the music industry, there's not that many of us Asian, looking people.
Interesting.
Even when I go to conferences, which I go to very niche conferences, like specifically about having your music in film and TV and ads and all of that. And so they're relatively small, maybe like a few hundred to a few thousand at the most. We're very, very, very small percentage of the people there. And so whenever I met another Asian American musician in those conferences, I immediately want to talk to them because I'm like, there's not that many of us. Like, what's your experience been like, and just kind of comparing notes. So we were talking and we found out that we had experiences that I thought were singular to me, that just happened to me, that it was just a random thing. And she's like, no, that's a thing that happens to Asian people. She grew up in Texas, near the border. So we were talking about her experience too, growing up in Texas, and how that's very different from, me being in California, for example.
Totally.
And so that was also around the time when anti-Asian hate was at the peak. And so initially we were like, maybe we should have a podcast to talk about our experiences and talk about the fact that we're not a monolith, right? Like we were talking before, and showcase those diverse experiences under the Asian diaspora umbrella. So initially the focus was to humanize Asian people because we're not just those stereotypes. There's so many stories out there that are very different from what you would expect from an Asian American. And as soon as we started recording, I think maybe like 5 or 6 interviews in, we realized that that was not what this podcast was about at all. Because people, so I was asking people what your experience was like, as somebody who grew up Asian in America. And a lot of people would be saying things like, nobody's ever asked me what my experience has been. Nobody's ever asked me how I was treated as an Asian person. Nobody's ever asked me what I thought about, X, Y, and Z when people said, these things. And I realized that it was a place where a lot of people were processing those experiences for the first time. And so then I shifted the focus to be a space where we can do those, process those things, but also reflect on how our community can do better, because there's a lot of anti-Blackness, for example, in Asian community. There's a lot of Islamophobia as well in East Asian communities. There's all these issues that, yes, we could focus on how the white people are bad, but, we're not perfect either. So my focus has shifted to creating a safe space for us to process our experiences, but also being like, we need to be accountable too. What are we doing that's problematic? And how can we address that with love and compassion and build understanding with other marginalized minorities, with other groups? Like, for example, there's a lot of homophobia, a lot of transphobia in Asian communities and Asian cultures. And that's one of the big things that I try to address with the podcast as well. So my friend is not part of the podcast anymore because she's busy with her day job and her music business, which she's crushing.
Nice.
And so I've been doing it by myself. But yeah, that's a big focus for me, to create a space that feels safe, but also create a space that challenges us.
And why have you noticed that lots of people say, no one's ever asked me that?
Mostly about what it has been like being Asian in America.
And how come people are not wondering?
Asian people's opinions are not asked for by white people. We're assumed to have no opinions, and like to be just very demure, very like quiet, shy, no leadership material, So and also I think in some circles it can be like, if you're like me, like you're relatively pale skinned, right? You could be in a friend group that's mostly white and they'll think, oh, you're not like the others, you're one of us, right? Like, yeah, the
Yes.
proximity to whiteness. And so sometimes, because they're trying to fit in, because they're trying to survive, they're not going to bring it up, right? Because it doesn't feel like that's gonna help them.
Right.
Like if you're a high school teenager and like people already think Asian food smells weird, you don't want to emphasize your Asianness, you don't want to
Totally.
emphasize that you're different. You just want to blend in. And so, yeah, a lot of people never had the opportunity, because also when they go home, their parents, most of them are immigrant parents. They're working really hard. Maybe they don't speak English very well. They don't have the vocabulary. They don't have the kind of emotional bandwidth, or even just the cultural precedent to have such conversations.
I think in a way, and this is of course not the Oppression Olympics, but I resonate with what you said about nobody asks Asian people what they think because it's assumed that either you are quiet or you don't say much, or like,
Yeah.
which is really, it's even hard for me to say, but it's like your existence is dismissed,
Yeah. And also I think there might be an element of, you should be grateful you're here.
Right.
It's like, what are you complaining about?
Yeah, and I love your podcast name, which is Nuanced, because I was literally, there's so many layers.
Yeah.
Not just the bringing up how we are feeling, but also saying, what are we doing?
Yeah. Like, how are we helping them?
Totally.
Right? Like, because we're helping them oppress us sometimes.
100%. And there's that layer of safety, of protection, of, yeah, I'm not going to say anything because otherwise I put myself in danger.
Mm-hmm.
And so staying quiet and assimilating and, kind of like navigating without being noticed, it's easier, it's safer, it's protection.
Yeah.
Which I think Latinos do many times.
Yeah.
And so that's where I was like, it's not the Oppression Olympics, because it's not like we go through that too, but it's similar. And I think we could see it in so many different groups. And it's something that I grew up in Mexico City, and it's skin color has been something that has been so ingrained since the beginning of time that I think it's one of the beginning pieces to get people to build safety.
Yeah.
Like, I'm also pretty light, and that has gotten me into so many places
Yeah.
and access to so many things.
Yeah.
And so that proximity also, I think, comes with the responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So much.
Yeah.
So Nuance, your podcast, is you do seasons.
Yes. And this latest season has been a little different. So typically it's an interview show like yours, but this 5th season I decided to do a narrative limited series. So half the episode is narrative format, and it's based on academic journals and books that I've read about the topic, and I write out a script, I read it, and then the other half is me discussing that episode with somebody from the queer Asian community, because I'm not from the queer Asian community. I wanted to make sure that they're included, that their voices are heard. And it started because so many of my guests from the queer Asian community were telling me very similar things, where, there's anti-Asian sentiment in the queer community, and there's anti-queer sentiment in the Asian community. And so they feel like they never belong anywhere fully, because in Asian culture, they feel like they have to kind of mute, like tone down their, queer identity somehow. And in queer spaces, there's a lot of very overt anti-Asian sentiment, like dating profiles for gay men often have no fats, no femmes, no Asians. Like, that's a thing. And I was like, what? When I heard that, I was like, now?
That is wild.
And they're like, yeah, that's the thing. And I've seen many, many people talk about this since. So my goal with this was to show that in our cultures, right now, our cultures, Asian cultures, are very homophobic, transphobic, all the things. But there was a time before modern times when there was a lot of sexual diversity. There was a lot of more openness to gender fluidity. There was just all kinds of really beautiful, wholesome stories that were then buried when modernization happened, when westernization happened. So my goal with the series was to show, okay, this transphobia, this homophobia is not necessarily part of our culture, and we can choose to leave it behind. And by the way, here's how it came to be in our culture. And I felt that people who have talked to me about these experiences, they would feel seen in those stories, and that has been confirmed by everyone who has listened to the show from the queer Asian community. And they would tell me, if I had this when I was a kid, I would have felt less alone. I wouldn't have felt like I was the only one. I wouldn't have felt that there was something wrong with me. I thought I was the only one. So I really hope that this series can be a resource for young people, especially who are trying to navigate all of that and maybe are scared to talk about it with their immediate family, especially if you grow up in a conservative rural town in, America. And
Totally.
the white people around you are conservative, the Asian people around you are conservative, you don't really know who to talk to. I mean, of course, now with the internet, it's a little bit easier for people to find their community, but still having access to those stories, I hope that it's a point where people can start having conversations within the Asian community and be like, hey, did you know that all the Chinese emperors had documented male favorite lovers in the history books? Like, that's interesting, right? Like, what happened there? And having a conversation like, so how come we were totally fine with gay men and there were even gay marriages in China? Like, what? There was even a god of same-sex love? What?
Queer people have existed.
Yeah. So
it's not a new thing.
Yeah. So that was the goal, is to provide a fun resource that is backed by research, but that is accessible to a wider audience, because sometimes the academic stuff is really dry and really boring to read.
Indeed. And I love that you break it down. So tell us all the places and spaces where we can find you.
nuancespod.com is the website, and we're nuancespod on all social media. If you want to find me, it's LAZOU, LAZOU, on all the social platforms as well.
And so This season is about queerness.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a next season planned?
I'm debating between a few different potential ideas. I haven't settled on one yet. I think I might alternate between interview seasons and like limited series seasons because I still do want to do interviews. Um, I haven't covered a lot of different cultures that fall under the Asian umbrella. Like there's so many.
So many.
But yeah, I haven't settled on one yet.
Well, I'm excited to see what's to come.
Thank you.
Thank you, LAZOU, for coming to Café con Pam.
Thank you so much for having
This
me.
was so fun. I learned so much.
Sabrosura pa' ti que.
All right, listeners, that was my conversation with LAZOU. It was so rich because I realized also we haven't had a lot of Asian descent people, and I think also tuning into other people's experiences allows us to grow and expand even further into our own knowledge. Because as you may have watched during the conversation, I even started questioning my own way of assuming someone of Asian descent exists, which is also nuanced, just like LAZOU's podcast is so great. So I hope that you enjoyed it. Please tag us, screenshot, tag us on the socials at Café con Pam Podcast. On the socials, cafeconpam.com to find the episode notes and read other stories. Listeners, I so appreciate when you choose to leave us ratings and reviews, whether it's stars or actual words where you give us feedback. I so appreciate it. It helps the show so much because this summer, every summer, downloads for podcasts go down. It's a historic thing. Kind of like generally in the podcast world, summertime is a low time for downloads because people travel, they go on vacation, they don't listen to podcasts. And so it would help a lot if you take some time to drop some stars and reviews, because then the podcast algorithm get excited about us and they share us with other people. So that way more people can find our stories. So appreciate it. Thank you so much. Y bueno, listeners, como siempre, stay shining.
Sabrosura pa' ti que.